Let your body settle. Let the weight of everything you carried today find somewhere else to rest. The mattress, the pillow, the quiet dark of the room around you. You do not need to hold any of it right now. There is nothing that requires your attention tonight except the sound of this voice and the slow, easy rhythm of your own breathing. In and out, in and out. Let each exhale be a little longer than the one before it. Let the room grow softer around you. We are going somewhere far from here tonight, further than any distance measured in miles or hours. We're going to a galaxy that exists in the imagination of millions of people across this world, a galaxy where the stars are populated and the Force moves through all living things like a current beneath still water, and where one man, patient beyond any ordinary understanding of patience, cruel in ways so refined they barely looked like cruelty at all, spent decades engineering the end of an order that had protected the peace for 1,000 years. His name, the name the galaxy would eventually know him by, was Palpatine. But before that name meant anything to anyone, before the white robes and the Senate chambers, and the voice that could make the destruction of democracy sound like its fulfillment, he was a boy on Naboo, and Naboo matters. And it matters because the places that shape us leave their marks in ways we do not always choose and cannot always see. And the particular mark that Naboo left on the boy who would become the Emperor is worth sitting with before we begin the longer story. Naboo is a world of surfaces. Its cities are built for beauty, domed and carved and painted in colours that catch the golden light of its sun and give it back to the eye multiplied. The people of Naboo prized art and philosophy and the appearance of civilization with a thoroughness that left very little room for the examination of what lay beneath appearances. It was a world, in other words, that had perfected the presentation of order while remaining largely uncurious about the nature of the forces that actually govern things. Young Palpatine absorbed this lesson early and completely. He understood, before he had words for the understanding, that the surface was what people responded to, and that the space between the surface and the reality beneath it was where all the actual work got done. Breathe in slowly, and let it go. His birth name was Sheev Palpatine, a name belonging to a minor noble family of no particular historical significance. Comfortable, respected in the local sense, possessed of the kind of moderate influence that allows a family to feel important without ever being important enough to attract the kind of scrutiny that would have been dangerous. It was the perfect origin for someone who intended to become something enormous. Enormous things are rarely anticipated when they are small. The most consequential transformations in history tend to begin in rooms that are easy to overlook. What the records of his early life reveal, and the records are incomplete, because Palpatine was already editing his history from an early age, already understanding that the past is not a fixed thing but a story that can be revised, is a young man of exceptional intelligence who was frustrated by the ceilings that Naboo's polite society placed on ambition. He was not cruel as a child in any visible way. He was charming. He was attentive to the feelings and needs of the people around him in the particular way that is sometimes genuine warmth and sometimes something colder. The attentiveness of someone cataloguing weaknesses rather than responding to them. It is very difficult to tell the difference from the outside. Even from the inside, the distinction can be surprisingly hard to locate. The Sith found him, or he found the Sith. The meeting point of those two things is a question the histories have never fully resolved. What is clear is that when Darth Plagueis, that ancient, brilliant, deeply unsettling moon who had spent decades pursuing the secrets of eternal life through the Force, identified the boy from Naboo as a potential apprentice, he was not discovering someone innocent and corrupting them. He was recognizing something that was already present, already formed, already pointed in a specific direction. Palpatine became Darth Sidious not through seduction, so much as through confirmation. He was told that what he had always felt, the contempt for limitation, the impatience with the slow machinery of legitimate power, the sense that the galaxy was being governed badly by people who did not understand it, was not a character flaw but a form of clarity, that it was the dark side of the Force making itself known in him, that he was not wrong, he was simply right in ways that ordinary people were not equipped to understand. This is the most dangerous thing any ideology can tell a person. Not that you are chosen, though that is dangerous enough, but that your contempt is wisdom, that your impatience is insight, that the distance you feel from the people around you is not loneliness but superiority. Palpatine received this message at a formative age, and it became the bedrock of everything that followed. Every subsequent move he made, every patient decade, every carefully managed relationship, every performance of concern and humility and democratic principle was built on that foundation. He was right, they were wrong, and he would prove it by reshaping the galaxy in his image. Rest here for a moment. Let the weight of that settle without urgency. A boy on a beautiful planet, learning the wrong lesson from the right observation. The galaxy would spend the next 50 years paying the price of that lesson. The Sith rule of two, that ancient doctrine established by Darth Bane 1,000 years before the events of the Clone Wars, held that there could only ever be two Sith at any time, a master and an apprentice, one to embody the power, one to crave it. The craving was essential. A student who did not hunger for the master's position could not be trusted to grow strong enough to be worthy of it. And a master who did not fear the student's hunger had already lost the essential tension that kept the Sith sharp. It was a doctrine built on the assumption that the fundamental relationship at the heart of the dark side was not loyalty, but the productive management of betrayal. The knowledge that the apprentice would eventually try to destroy the master, and the master's survival depending on being stronger than the attempt when it came. Darth Plagueis understood this. He was careful with Sidious in all the ways the doctrine required. He trained him, he withheld from him. He shared the secrets of midi-chlorian manipulation and the mysteries of life and death through the Force, with the measured generosity of a teacher who knows that the most valuable lessons are the ones given slowly. And then, on a night when Plagueis slept, and Sidious did not, the student enacted the oldest clause of the rule of two. He killed his master, not in rage, not in the heat of a confrontation, in cold, deliberate silence, with Plagueis unconscious from too much wine and celebration, with the night still and quiet and the deed accomplished before there was any possibility of resistance. The master who had taught him never to waste power wasted his life sleeping, and the apprentice who had learned everything his master had to teach took the title of master for himself and began looking for a student of his own. The philosophy of the Sith, as Darth Plagueis transmitted it to the young man who would become Darth Sidious, was not a philosophy of hatred. This is a common misunderstanding of the dark side and of those who gave themselves to it. The dark side was not about hating the galaxy. It was about seeing the galaxy clearly, without the comfortable fictions that the Jedi's light side doctrine required its practitioners to maintain. The Jedi spoke of peace and serenity and the will of the Force, but the Jedi also served a republic that ran on exploitation, on the suffering of the Outer Rim's forgotten populations, on the maintenance of the wealthy core world's prosperity, at the expense of everyone and everything beyond the Hydian way. The dark side did not require you to pretend otherwise. The dark side looked at power, and called it power. It looked at the machinery of governance and saw who it actually served and who it actually discarded. In this, it was not incorrect. Its error was in the conclusion it drew from the observation, not that the system should be reformed in service of the many, but that the system should be seized by the strongest, because strength was the only honest value in a galaxy that ran on strength, regardless of what its official ideologies claimed. Palpatine absorbed this philosophy with the thoroughness of someone who had always suspected it was true, and was grateful to finally have it confirmed. He was not a cruel man in the ordinary sense. He did not enjoy suffering for its own sake, did not take pleasure in inflicting pain the way lesser dark-siders sometimes did. What he felt toward the suffering he caused was something closer to indifference, which is a form of cruelty more thorough than the passionate kind because it does not require maintenance. Passionate cruelty burns itself out. Indifferent cruelty simply continues. He caused suffering because suffering was the price of the necessary actions, and the necessary actions were required by the plan, and the plan was larger and more important than any individual experience of pain. This is the logic that makes ordinary people into monsters without their ever having to experience themselves as monstrous. The cruelty is structural, not personal. The victims are not quite real to the perpetrator. The suffering is a side effect, not a feature. He moved to Coruscant. This was the next necessary step after the death of Plagueis, to establish himself in the political centre of the galaxy, to begin the long process of building the visible career that would carry the invisible plan to its conclusion. He arrived in the capital as what he appeared to be, a promising young senator from Naboo, intelligent and charming, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of the Republic's citizens. He was all of these things, and he was also none of them, in the way that very good performances contain enough truth to be undetectable as performance. He had opinions about policy. He had positions on legislation. He was a thoughtful colleague and an attentive listener, and a reliable vote on the committees that mattered. And across the years of his rise, he accumulated the loyalty of enough senators and the respect of enough colleagues that his influence in the chamber grew from peripheral to significant to central, all while the other face, the hooded figure, the Dark Lord directing the Trade Federation and cultivating the separatist movement and managing the Kamino and clone program through intermediaries, operated in the shadows that the Senate's lights could not reach. The Senate itself was not corrupt in any simple sense. It contained corrupt individuals and corrupt factions and structural incentives toward the prioritization of core world interests, but it also contained genuine public servants, people of real integrity who believed in the Republic and served it faithfully across long careers. These people were not Sidious's enemies, they were his cover. Their genuine devotion to democratic principles gave the institution a credibility that the corrupt elements alone could not have maintained, and Sidious relied on that credibility more than he relied on any individual ally. He needed the Republic to be real enough that its destruction would seem like a tragedy rather than a mercy. He needed people to mourn what was lost. Mourning requires something real to be lost. Let your breath slow. The night has only just begun. And the plan that Sidious carried in his mind as he left that room, the plan that would take decades to execute, that would require the patience of someone who understood that the longest games produce the largest prizes, was only just beginning to take the shape it would eventually become. Sleep carries you toward the next chapter now. The Republic is still standing. The Jedi are still at peace. The shadow has not yet begun to fall, but it is moving, slowly, deliberately, with the particular unhurried certainty of a man who has decided that time itself is one of his instruments. Segment number 2, the rule of 2, 1,000 years of patient darkness. Still here. Good. Let the breath come a little easier now. The body finds its rhythm when you stop correcting it, when you simply let the lungs do what they have always known how to do, in and out, steady and unhurried, old as life itself. There's nothing to manage tonight, nothing to decide. Only the voice, and the dark and the story moving through it like a slow river finding the sea. To understand Order 66, you have to understand the 1,000 years that preceded it. You have to understand what the Sith were, what they had become, and why the plan Darth Sidious executed was not an act of impulsive hatred, but the culmination of a project that had been running since long before he was born, a project inherited and refined and finally, in his hands, brought to completion. The Sith had not always been two. There was a time, deep in the galaxy's history, when the Sith were many, an order of dark side force users who built empires and fought wars and attempted repeatedly to destroy the Jedi Order and remake galactic civilization, according to the philosophy of power that the dark side embodied. They failed, not because they were weak, but because they were many. Because an order built on the philosophy that power is the ultimate value will inevitably turn that philosophy on itself. The Sith destroyed each other. They conspired and betrayed and fractured along lines of ambition, and every time they rose to challenge the Republic and the Jedi, they collapsed from the inside before the outside could bring them down. Darth Bane saw this. He was the sole survivor of the last great Sith War, a man who had watched his entire order consume itself in exactly the way the philosophy of power makes inevitable, and who had the particular kind of genius that can observe a catastrophic failure and extract from it not despair, but a lesson. The lesson was simple. The Sith needed scarcity. Abundance of Sith created competition that destroyed the Order before it could destroy its enemies. Two Sith, only two, never more, maintained the tension between power and hunger without allowing that tension to become civil war. The master held the power. The apprentice held the hunger, and together they were a precision instrument rather than a blunt force. Breathe. Let that thought settle. The 1,000 years between Bane and Sidious were not years of dormancy. They were years of accumulation. Each pair of Sith across those 10 centuries added something to the inheritance. Techniques, knowledge, contacts, resources hidden in accounts and vaults and systems that the Republic would never think to audit. The Sith operated in the dark in the most complete sense, not merely hidden from the Jedi, but hidden from the concept of their own existence. The Jedi believed the Sith extinct. This was not a convenient lie the Sith told about themselves. It was a condition they had deliberately engineered, letting the Republic and the Jedi reach the conclusion of Sith extinction, and then never providing any evidence sufficient to revise it. Two people, operating in absolute secrecy, leave very little trace. And the Jedi, who trusted the Force to guide them toward danger, were never guided toward a danger that was so carefully, so completely, so patiently invisible. This is the thing the Jedi Council could not admit when the Clone Wars finally began to reveal what had been hiding in plain sight. Their failure to detect the Sith was not simply a failure of surveillance, it was a failure of imagination. They had become, across their 1,000 years of peacekeeping, an order that managed the known. They catalogued the Force-sensitive children who were brought to them, trained them in the traditions that had been refined over millennia, sent them out into the galaxy to enforce the will of the Senate, and resolve the conflicts that diplomacy could not. They were very good at all of this. But they had been doing it for so long, from within an institution so established and so confident in its own methods, that they had lost the capacity to seriously consider that the galaxy might contain something they did not know how to see. Yoda felt it. This is documented in the accounts that survived the Purge. The great Jedi Master, 900 years old and still the most attuned of all the council members to the whispers of the living Force, repeatedly expressing an unease he could not locate or name, a disturbance, a shadow at the edge of his perception, something wrong in the texture of the Force that he could feel but not articulate. He raised it. The council discussed it, and then, with the institutional thoroughness of an organization that takes every concern seriously and converts it into a committee agenda item, they moved on. The unease was real. The response was inadequate. This is how most of the great failures in history work, not through ignorance of the problem, but through the gap between the scale of the threat and the scale of the response. Darth Sidious knew the Jedi better than the Jedi knew themselves. He had studied them for decades with the thoroughness of someone who understood that you do not defeat an enemy you have not completely understood. He knew their doctrine, he knew their methods, he knew the particular spiritual confidence that their connection to the Force gave them, and the way that confidence, over centuries, had calcified into something closer to certainty. He knew that they believed, genuinely believed, not as a tactical position but as a lived conviction, that the Force would not allow the Sith to operate undetected in the heart of the Republic. He knew this belief would prevent them from looking as hard as they should have looked, and he used it. Rest a moment. The patience required to operate in this way, to plan across decades, to maintain a public identity of perfect virtue while embodying its opposite in private, to resist the temptation to move before the plan is complete, is not a human quality in any ordinary sense. It is something else, something colder and more disciplined and more terrifying than ordinary cruelty, because ordinary cruelty at least announces itself. What Sidious practiced was the cruelty of the architect, remote, structural, expressed in systems rather than acts. The grand plan was what the Sith tradition called it. Not Sidious's invention. He inherited the concept from the succession of masters and apprentices who had developed it across the centuries since Bane, but he was the one who executed it. Who took the theoretical architecture of a plan to destroy the Republic from the inside and converted it into specific actions, specific relationships, specific crises manufactured and managed across decades until the moment was right. The Senate seat was the key. Not a throne, not a military command, not any of the instruments of power that announced themselves as power. A Senate seat. The vote of one among 1,000 voices in a body that governed the galaxy through the patient accumulation of consensus. From that seat, with the tools of democratic process and the armor of elected legitimacy, a Sith Lord could do things that no army could accomplish, could reshape the galaxy's laws, could position resources and loyalties, could, when the moment arrived, make the destruction of everything he had sworn to protect look like the only available option. The Jedi Order's failure to detect the Sith across 1,000 years was not, despite how it is sometimes characterized, a simple intelligence failure. It was a failure with roots in the very philosophy that made the Jedi great. The light side of the Force, as the Jedi practiced it, emphasized openness. Openness to the will of the Force, openness to the needs of others, openness to the interconnection of all living things. This openness was not naive. It was earned through centuries of disciplined practice, refined through countless generations of master and Padawan, expressed in the serenity that the most accomplished Jedi carried as a quality of presence rather than merely a mood. But openness has a cost. The cost is that you are not, by disposition, looking for the hidden threat. You're experiencing the world as it is rather than scanning it for what it might be concealing. The Sith's 1,000 years of secrecy was specifically engineered to exploit this quality. Darth Bane understood that the Jedi's openness was their greatest strength and their most accessible vulnerability. If the Sith remained hidden, truly hidden, without the provocations and confrontations that had previously revealed them, the Jedi's openness would work against them. They would not, in their fundamental orientation toward the world, be actively looking for something that gave no indication of being there. The absence of a signal is not a signal of absence for a mind trained in presence rather than surveillance. The Jedi felt the dark side in individuals who were actively using it. A Sith Lord who was not actively drawing on the dark side in their vicinity was, for practical purposes, invisible. Darth Sidious added a refinement that Bane had not fully developed: active misdirection. It was not enough to be invisible. The most secure form of concealment was to be visible as something else entirely. Palpatine's public persona was not merely a mask. It was a structure carefully maintained over decades that presented the Force, to any Jedi who came close enough to feel it, as the signature of a capable but unremarkable non-Force sensitive mind. He had learned, through the depth of his dark side mastery, to suppress his Force presence to a level indistinguishable from the background noise of a galaxy full of living beings. When Jedi sat in meetings with him, when they discussed strategy and policy and the prosecution of the Clone Wars, they felt nothing from him that suggested anything beyond a man of considerable intelligence and modest, midi-chlorian count. This was an extraordinary achievement. It required constant, active maintenance. It was the sustained effort of a lifetime conducted across every interaction, never faltering. This is perhaps the most frightening aspect of the entire plan, when you examine it closely enough. Sidious was not a man who could relax. The mask could never come off because the mask was not a thing you wore and removed. It was a thing you performed continuously at the level of the Force itself, with every breath and every spoken word and every carefully modulated emotional response in every room full of people you intended to eventually destroy. He lived inside the performance for decades, and the performance never failed. It was the most complete sustained deception in galactic history, and it was accomplished not through technology or sorcery but through discipline, through the absolute mastery of the self that the dark side at its highest expression demands. The paradox is worth sitting with. The quality that allowed Sidious to deceive the Jedi so completely was a form of the same discipline the Jedi themselves practiced: the control of the self, the suppression of the reactive in favor of the intentional. The Jedi practiced it in service of peace. Sidious practiced it in service of power. The methods were more similar than either side would have been comfortable acknowledging. The difference was entirely in the direction the practice pointed. The rule of two contained within it a beautiful and terrible irony that Sidious, who had both benefited from it and been shaped by it, understood completely. The doctrine was designed to produce the strongest possible Sith by eliminating the weak through the master-apprentice succession. But the process of becoming the master, of killing Plagueis, of assuming sole ownership of the grand plan, had also eliminated from Sidious the only relationship in his life that contained any reciprocity. Plagueis had known what he was, had seen the full scope of his power and his purpose without the filter of the Palpatine mask. After Plagueis, every relationship Sidious formed was a performance, a management exercise, a strategic asset. He had no one to be honest with. He had won his solitude along with his power, and the winning of it had cost him the only kind of knowledge that comes from being genuinely known by another person. This did not trouble him. He had long since exchanged the warmth of being known for the cold clarity of needing no one. But it did mean that when he finally encountered something he had not predicted, love of the kind Luke Skywalker carried for his father, He had no internal reference point from which to understand it, no emotional memory that could model what such love was capable of producing in the person who felt it. The 1,000 years of darkness were ending. The plan was entering its final phase, and the galaxy, looking at the distinguished senator from Naboo with his calm eyes, and his reasonable voice and his genuine concern for the suffering of ordinary people everywhere, had no idea what it was looking at. Let that be the last thought before you drift. The darkness does not always look like darkness. Sometimes it looks like a man in white robes, speaking carefully about peace. Segment number 3, the Phantom Menace, manufacturing the first crisis. Deeper now. The breath has found its own pace, and you no longer need to think about it. The body is good at this, at the maintenance of its own rhythms, at keeping itself alive and warm and present without requiring conscious instruction. Trust it. Let the mind follow the voice into the story, and let everything else rest. Every great deception requires a first act, something that establishes the deceiver in a position of trust, while simultaneously creating the conditions the deception will eventually exploit. For Darth Sidious, the first act was the blockade of Naboo, his own home world, the place of his birth and his early education, the planet whose beauty he had grown up among, and whose people he was now prepared to sacrifice on the altar of political necessity. The Trade Federation. That vast commercial empire of Nemoidian merchants whose greed and cowardice made them, in Sidious's estimation, the perfect instrument, powerful enough to create the crisis he needed, frightened enough to be managed without difficulty, and ultimately disposable in the way that all instruments are disposable once their purpose has been served. He came to them as a hooded figure, a voice of authority from an unknown source, offering them protection from the Senate's trade taxation bills in exchange for their compliance. They did not know who he was, they did not need to. What they needed was what he was offering, and what he needed was the blockade, and the transaction was completed in the dark with the particular efficiency of deals made between parties who understand that the less either side knows about the other's true purpose, the safer both of them are. The blockade of Naboo served multiple functions simultaneously. This is a quality worth noticing in everything Sidious did. He was constitutionally incapable of single-purpose action. Every move he made was designed to accomplish several things at once, to advance multiple tracks of the plan simultaneously, to ensure that even if one intended outcome failed to materialize, the others would compensate. The blockade created a humanitarian crisis that the Senate's cumbersome processes could not resolve quickly. It gave him, as Senator Palpatine, the opportunity to appear deeply concerned for his people, while the bureaucratic machinery of legitimate governance failed them visibly and publicly. It maneuvered the sitting Supreme Chancellor into a position of demonstrated ineffectiveness, and it positioned Padme Amidala, the young Queen of Naboo, idealistic and brave and politically inexperienced in exactly the ways Sidious required, to make a motion of no confidence that would remove that Chancellor and open the succession. Breathe in slowly. Hold it for a moment, and release. The motion of no confidence is worth understanding as a piece of political engineering rather than simply as a plot point. Padme made it genuinely, from genuine frustration and genuine concern for her suffering people. That is what made it useful to Sidious. A manufactured motion would have looked manufactured. A genuine one, made by a person of unimpeachable character acting in obvious good faith, had a credibility that no amount of orchestration could have produced artificially. Sidious did not need to instruct Padme to make the motion. He needed only to ensure that the conditions existed, which would make a person of her character make it inevitably. The engineering was in the conditions, not in the actor. The actor performed freely, which is the only way a performance has the ring of truth. The Supreme Chancellor who fell was Finis Valorum, an honest man by all accounts, a decent administrator caught in a Senate so riddled with bureaucratic obstruction and quiet corruption that genuine governance had become nearly impossible. He was not a villain. He was simply inadequate to a crisis that had been specifically engineered to defeat the kind of governance he represented. Moderate, deliberate, operating through legitimate channels. He fell because Sidious had designed a problem that legitimate channels could not solve quickly enough, and the galaxy rewarded him for this failure by giving Sidious exactly what he had arranged to receive. Chancellor Palpatine. The Senate's emergency session, summoned in the shadow of Naboo's suffering, elected Senator Palpatine to the highest office in the Republic with an outpouring of democratic support that would have been moving if it had been spontaneous. He accepted with reluctance. He expressed humility. He promised to lay down the extraordinary powers the emergency was requiring him to accept the moment the emergency had passed. He was believed. He was believed because he was very good at being believed, and because the alternative, that the man they had just elected had manufactured the emergency that made his election inevitable, was a thought the Senate was not equipped to think. On Naboo itself, the crisis resolved with unexpected help. 2 Jedi ambassadors, a young Gungan named Jar Jar Binks, a queen who refused to wait for the Senate's deliberations, and a small boy found on a desert world in the Outer Rim, whose midi-chlorian count suggested something unprecedented. Qui-Gon Jinn brought the boy to the Jedi Council. The Council was uncertain. The boy was trained anyway, in the way that the Council's certainties were always complicated by Qui-Gon's insistence on following the Force rather than the rules. And Anakin Skywalker entered the story. Sit with that name for a moment. Anakin Skywalker, the boy who would become Darth Vader, the pivot point around which the entire final phase of the grand plan would turn. He arrived in the story as a consequence of the blockade of Naboo, as a chain of events set in motion by a crisis Sidious manufactured, travelling through a situation Sidious managed, ending up in the hands of an institution Sidious intended to destroy. Whether the Force brought Anakin to the Jedi to save them, or to fulfill a prophecy that would ultimately require their destruction, is a question that the Jedi spent the next decade asking, and never satisfactorily answering. What Sidious knew, watching from his Chancellor's office with his reasonable eyes and his patient smile, was that the boy was important. He did not yet know exactly how. The Force does not reveal its designs completely, even to those who have given themselves to its dark currents. But he knew that the most powerful Force-sensitive in living memory had just entered the Jedi Order as a 10-year-old slave boy from Tatooine, already attached to people in ways that the Jedi Code considered dangerous, already carrying in his emotional life the seeds of the vulnerability that would eventually make him available to the dark side. The Trade Federation's Viceroy Newt Gunray was, in his way, the perfect illustration of the kind of person Sidious chose as an instrument. Possessed of resources and cowardice in roughly equal measure, motivated entirely by self-interest, and willing to perform whatever role he was assigned as long as the role appeared to serve his commercial interests and his personal survival. He was not the last such instrument in the plan. The galaxy was full of people like him, people whose self-interest made them predictable, whose cowardice made them controllable, and whose resources made them useful. Sidious did not despise them. He found them invaluable. The tragedy of being genuinely powerful, in the dark side's understanding, is that powerful people are rare and therefore rare instruments. The galaxy's abundance of frightened and greedy people represented an inexhaustible supply of the kind of tool that could be deployed and discarded without loss. Qui-Gon Jinn's death on Naboo was not part of Sidious's plan, but it was not unwelcome. Qui-Gon was the kind of Jedi who complicated plans, the kind whose relationship with the living force was too immediate and too unmediated by institutional thinking to be reliable from a plan management perspective. He followed the Force rather than the Council, which made him the most difficult kind of opponent, unpredictable, uncontrollable by the arguments and political pressures that could sometimes be used to redirect the Order's attention. He was the one who had found Anakin and recognized him, and his death ensured that Anakin would be trained by Obi-Wan Kenobi instead, a man of enormous skill and genuine love for his student, and also, from Sidious's perspective, a more comprehensible adversary. Obi-Wan followed the rules. He trained Anakin according to the doctrine, his reserve, his emotional restraint, his Jedi correctness. All of these qualities, admirable in themselves, would leave Anakin with the specific emotional deficits that Sidious intended to exploit. The midichlorian test results that identified Anakin as the Chosen One, the prophesied figure who would bring balance to the Force, were, from Sidious's perspective, information of the highest possible value. The Jedi read the prophecy as a promise of salvation. Sidious read it as a description of a weapon. If the Chosen One was the most powerful Force user in the galaxy's history, and if that Force user could be turned to the dark side at the critical moment, then the Chosen One's fulfillment of the prophecy could be engineered to mean the destruction of the Jedi rather than the Sith. The prophecy's language was ambiguous. Bring balance to the Force, destroy the Sith. A galaxy with only 2 Sith and 10,000 Jedi was not, by any reasonable mathematical definition, balanced. Removing the 10,000 might be exactly what balance required. Sidious did not believe this precisely, but he understood that the prophecy could be made to mean it, and that understanding was enough. Padme Amidala was not a tool in the plan. This is worth stating clearly because she is sometimes read as simply a political instrument that Sidious used to remove Valorum and install himself. She was not. She was a genuinely exceptional person, acting entirely under her own agency, from genuine love of her people, with a kind of political courage that is rare in any system at any level. She made the motion of no confidence, because it was the right thing to do given what she knew. The fact that what she knew had been arranged to produce exactly this response does not diminish her agency. It illuminates the nature of Sidious's manipulation. He did not control people. He controlled information and circumstances. He arranged the conditions under which free people made free choices that happened to be the choices he needed them to make. The freedom was real. The shaping of its context was also real. Both things were simultaneously true. Coruscant itself, the planet-wide city, the capital of the Republic, the center of the known galaxy, was, by the time of the blockade of Naboo, a monument to the specific kind of civilization that Sidious intended to replace. Beautiful in places, squalid in others, its gleaming Senate towers rising above the underworld's perpetual darkness, in a spatial metaphor so obvious it barely needed articulation. The Senate at the top, the forgotten at the bottom, and in between a complex gradient of wealth and influence and aspiration and despair that Sidious had observed and understood since his first months on Coruscant. He loved the city the way you can love something you intend to fundamentally transform, with appreciation for what it was and complete willingness to make it into something else. The planet Coruscant processed approximately 1 trillion beings through its corridors and platforms on any given day, a density of human and non-human life so extreme that the concept of individual privacy had been almost completely dissolved by the sheer impossibility of genuine solitude in a world where every surface was built upon and every skylane was occupied, and the light of the planet itself was visible from deep space as a persistent glow. In this impossible density, Sidious moved as senator and then as chancellor, with the ease of someone who had learned early that the best hiding place is the most visible location. He was everywhere and known by everyone, and therefore examined by no one with the thoroughness that genuine concealment would have attracted. His office was a fishbowl. His private spaces were a secret so complete that most people who worked in the building had no idea they existed. The public man and the private lord occupied the same physical locations and were never seen simultaneously, because the public man was so constant and so consistent and so thoroughly documented that the possibility of the private lord inhabiting the same body was simply not a thought that formed in the minds of the people around him. The first act was complete. The Chancellor's office had been secured. The Jedi had a new student who did not fit their templates. The Republic was grateful to its new leader and already half in love with the story of his concern for his suffering people. And somewhere in the deep shadow of the Force, a plan 1,000 years in the making moved one measured step forward. Rest now. The night is long and the story has barely begun. Let it carry you gently toward the next chapter, toward the decade of patience that came after this one, toward the war that was being assembled in the dark even as the galaxy believed it was at peace. Segment number 4. The Clone Army. Engineering. A war from both sides. Your breathing is slower now. The body is settling in the way it does when true rest is close, when the muscles have stopped holding their daytime tension and the mind has let go of its inventory of unfinished things. Let that settling continue. You are doing nothing wrong. You're doing exactly what the night requires. 10 years passed between the blockade of Naboo and the beginning of the Clone Wars, 10 years during which Chancellor Palpatine governed with the mild and reasonable authority of a man who had promised not to exceed his mandate, who repeatedly expressed his willingness to return the emergency powers he had been granted, who maintained the appearance of democratic principle with such consistency and such apparent sincerity that the Senate rewarded him, again and again, with the extension of those powers. He was patient in the way that only someone with a complete plan can be patient. the patience of a man who knows the destination and can therefore endure any length of journey to reach it. During those 10 years, on a world of rain called Kamino at the edge of the galaxy's charts, an army was growing. The Kaminoans were cloners of extraordinary sophistication, a tall and gentle people who had survived the flooding of their world by developing technologies that other civilizations had never needed. They received a visitor a decade before the Clone Wars began, a man named Sheev, a Jedi Master, who commissioned from them a clone army for the Republic. The Republic had not authorized this commission. The Jedi Council had not authorized it. Sheev acted alone, driven by a vision of coming conflict that the Council had dismissed as too extreme to warrant preparation. He was killed shortly after placing the order, before he could report what he had done or answer for it, and the army he had commissioned grew in the warm tanks of Kamino without the knowledge of the Senate, the Jedi, or any legitimate authority in the Republic. Breathe slowly. Let the complexity of this be quiet rather than urgent. The template for the army was a bounty hunter named Jango Fett, a Mandalorian warrior of exceptional skill who accepted the commission in exchange for credits and for one unmodified clone, a son he intended to raise himself. Jango did not know who had ultimately arranged his selection. He knew only the intermediary. He accepted the terms and provided the genetic material, and the Kaminoans set about producing 1 million soldiers, each one genetically identical to the original, each one conditioned for obedience, each one accelerated through a modified growth process that produced an adult soldier in half the time a natural human body would require. They were, the Kaminoans explained to the Jedi who eventually discovered them, a superior product, loyal, disciplined, reliable in ways that volunteer armies could never be. The Jedi who arrived on Kamino, Obi-Wan Kenobi, following a chain of clues that led him to the edge of the galaxy, found an army waiting for the Republic's use and no clear explanation of how it had gotten there. Sheev was dead. The order had been placed in the Jedi's name. The Kaminoans were matter-of-fact about the whole arrangement, because from their perspective a commission had been placed, and they had fulfilled it, and the philosophical questions of its authorization were not their concern. Obi-Wan reported what he had found. The Council debated. The Senate learned of the army's existence at the moment a separatist crisis erupted that made the army appear providential, a crisis that had been developing for years, led by a former Jedi named Count Dooku, who had left the Order, embraced the dark side, and become Darth Tyrannus, Darth Sidious's new apprentice. Dooku, Tyrannus, the man who wore 2 names the way Sidious wore 2 faces. Count Dooku of Sereno was a Jedi master of genuine ability and genuine disillusionment, a man who had come to believe, not entirely incorrectly, that the Republic was corrupt, that the Senate was compromised, that the Jedi Order had become the enforcers of a political system that no longer deserved enforcement. He left the Order. He grieved Qui-Gon Jinn's death, because Qui-Gon had been his Padawan and he had loved him. He was vulnerable, in his disillusionment and his grief, to the approach Sidious made. And Sidious was very good at finding people in their vulnerability and offering them something that looked like clarity. What Dooku did not know, could not know, because Sidious revealed only what was necessary and never more, was that his role in the grand plan was always instrumental. He was not the future, he was the mechanism. The separatist movement he led was not intended to win. It was intended to create a war that the Republic would need an army to fight, and to last long enough for that army to shape the Republic's institutions in the ways that Sidious required. Every battle the Separatist won was a battle Sidious permitted. Every battle they lost was a battle Sidious arranged. The war was a performance conducted on a galactic stage, with both sides being directed by the same dark hand. This is the part that is hardest to hold. Not the cruelty of it. Cruelty is comprehensible, even the very large kinds, but the scale of the indifference. Hundreds of thousands of clones fighting and dying on worlds across the galaxy. Billions of civilians caught in the crossfire of battles that were being managed from a Chancellor's office in Coruscant. The Jedi generals leading their troops into combat that was genuine in every respect for everyone involved in it, except for the man who had arranged it all. He felt none of it. The suffering was a budget line. The deaths were a scheduling consideration. The Force moved through all living things, and he had given himself to its dark currents so completely that the living things the Force moved through were simply material. Rest here. Breathe. The weight of that is real and does not need to be carried all at once. Anakin Skywalker was a general in this war. He was brilliant at it, in the way that he was brilliant at everything that required intuition and courage and physical skill, and he was deeply damaged by it in the way that people are damaged by killing, even killing done in a righteous cause. He loved his troops. He loved them with the open, uncomplicated love of someone who had grown up without a father and found in the brotherhood of soldiers something close to the family structure he had never had. He named his clone troopers. He learned their faces. He mourned them when they died. He did not know, could not have imagined, that the men he was grieving and the men he was avenging were waiting, somewhere in the circuitry of their modified biology, for an order he would eventually help to give. The separatist movement that Dooku led was, in the galaxy's understanding, a genuine political phenomenon, a coalition of systems and commercial interests that believed the Republic had become too centralized, too corrupt, too captured by the core world's interests to serve the broader galaxy's needs. Some of these complaints were legitimate. The Republic was imperfect. The Senate was compromised by the same corporate interests that the separatists nominally opposed. The worlds of the Outer Rim received less protection, less investment, less representation per capita than the core. The grievances were real, which made the movement real, which made the war real, which was the entire point. A manufactured political movement with no genuine basis would not have attracted the millions of beings who genuinely believed in the separatist cause. The manufactured element was not the movement itself, but the decision to make it a military conflict rather than a political one. Count Dooku's brilliance was the tragedy at the centre of the Clone Wars. He was genuinely intelligent, genuinely skilled, genuinely devoted to a vision of galactic reform that, in its honest form, stripped of the dark side's contamination, would have made the Republic better. He had identified real problems. His critique of the Jedi Order's complicity with a corrupt system was not entirely wrong. He had spent decades trying to work within institutions that did not reform as quickly as the problems required, and when Sidious offered him both the validation of his analysis and the power to act on it, he accepted. He did not know what he was serving. He believed he was serving a better galaxy. The distance between his belief and the reality of what he was actually doing, the distance between Count Dooku of Sereno and Darth Tyrannus, the Sith Lord executing the grand plan, is the distance that makes his arc genuinely tragic rather than merely villainous. The clones themselves are the most complicated moral element of the entire story. They were created without consent, grown from a genetic template that had no say in its use, given accelerated lives that aged them at twice the normal rate so that their service could be extracted more efficiently, programmed with behavioral modifications they did not know about, and deployed in a war whose purpose was nothing that they were told it was. They were also, within these constraints, full people. They formed relationships, developed individual personalities distinct from the template, expressed preferences and humours and loyalties that were genuinely their own. The contradiction between the personhood they clearly possessed and the tool status their origin imposed on them was a contradiction the Republic never resolved, because resolving it would have required questioning the war, and questioning the war required acknowledging that the war's architects might not have the interests of the Republic at heart. Rex, Cody, Fives, Echo, the named clones who appear throughout the Clone Wars stories are not named to make them individual exceptions to a dehumanized mass. They are named to make the mass visible as what it was. 1 million individuals, each one carrying in their genetic identicalness the paradox of a civilization that could create persons and deny them personhood in the same breath. Fives was the one who came closest to uncovering the inhibitor chip program, who got close enough to the truth that he was killed for it, his death written off as instability, his discovery buried under the classified records that Sidious maintained with the same thoroughness he maintained everything else. The truth was available. The system was not designed to receive it. Obi-Wan and Anakin's relationship during the Clone Wars was the most important relationship in either of their lives, and it was expressed almost entirely through the language of action, crisis, and the particular dry affection of two people who trust each other so completely that they no longer need to say so explicitly. They argued about tactics and strategy and protocol. They saved each other's lives with the frequency and the casualness of people for whom saving each other's lives had become a reflexive response. They disagreed about everything, and agreed about the things that mattered. Obi-Wan knew that Anakin was different from the standard-issue Jedi Knight he had been trained to produce. He did not know exactly how different, or in which direction the difference would eventually point. He loved him in the reserved and inadequate way that the Jedi doctrine permitted, and it was not enough. And it was also more than nothing, and the combination would have to do. The Gungan city of Otoh Gunga, hidden beneath the surface of Naboo's lake, was one of the first things Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan encountered when they arrived on Naboo in response to the Trade Federation's blockade. The Gungans, a species the Naboo had historically regarded with condescension, the surface people's attitude toward the lake, people carrying the particular quality of prejudice that proximity without genuine acquaintance produces, turned out to be essential to the resolution of the crisis. Jar Jar Binks, the exile who attached himself to the Jedi, became the bridge, not through calculation. Through the particular grace that unself-conscious generosity sometimes produces, he simply helped because helping was available, and the help led to the alliance that ended the blockade. Sidious had not predicted this element. He had expected the crisis to resolve through the channels he had managed. The unexpected element of Gungan military alliance was a reminder that the plan, however thorough, operated in a galaxy full of people making their own choices, and the people's choices were not always predictable. He filed the reminder and adjusted the plan and moved on. The plan was designed to accommodate the unpredictable. That was what made it a plan rather than a wish. The Clone Wars lasted 3 years. They produced heroes and villains and atrocities and acts of extraordinary courage, and they produced one other thing that was their real purpose: a galaxy exhausted by war, grateful for peace, prepared to accept any arrangement that ended the killing, and deeply, completely, pathologically dependent on the one man who seemed to have the strength to end it. Sleep toward the next part now. The war is almost over, and the thing that comes after the war is what the war was always for. Segment number 5. Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One in the Open Wound. You are drifting beautifully. The voice is coming from somewhere warm and close, and the night outside is doing what nights do. Being still, being dark, being the vast and comfortable container for whatever the day could not hold. Let it hold everything now. There is nothing you need to keep. Let the breath move in its own time. To understand how Order 66 was possible, you have to understand Anakin Skywalker. Not as the villain the story eventually requires him to become, but as the person he was before that becoming. The complicated, gifted, emotionally volatile, deeply loving young man whose virtues and whose wounds were, in Sidious's analysis, the same thing. What made Anakin extraordinary was inseparable from what made him available to the dark side. The strength and the vulnerability were a single piece. He was born into slavery on Tatooine, a desert world at the edge of civilization where the suns were twin and the moisture was scarce, and the people who found themselves there were generally people who had run out of better options. His mother Shmi raised him alone with a love that was total and uncomplaining and practical, the love of someone who has very little and gives all of it. He was 9 years old when Qui-Gon Jinn found him, recognized the Force moving in him with an intensity that dwarfed anything the Jedi Master had encountered before, and began the chain of events that would take him from Tatooine to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. The separation from his mother was the first wound. He carried her with him the way people carry the most important things they have lost, not always consciously, but in the texture of every attachment he subsequently formed, in the particular fierceness of his need for the people he loved to remain safe. He was told by the Jedi that attachment was the path to suffering, and this was true in the technical sense that the Jedi meant it, and it was also profoundly unhelpful to a boy whose capacity for love was his most defining characteristic, and who was being asked to perform a surgery on his own emotional life that he simply did not have the tools to complete. Breathe gently. Let that image settle. A boy being told that what makes him most human is exactly what he must learn to release. The Jedi were not wrong in their diagnosis. The prophecy that called Anakin the Chosen One, the one who would bring balance to the Force, who would destroy the Sith and end the darkness, was, in the Jedi's understanding, a promise of salvation. They trained him toward it with the best intentions of an order that had centuries of wisdom, and also the specific blind spots that centuries of wisdom tend to produce. They did not lie to him. They did not deliberately misuse him, but they failed to see, with the clarity the moment required, that a boy shaped by loss and driven by fear of loss was not a vessel that their doctrines of non-attachment could safely contain. The doctrine was not wrong. The application was inadequate. He loved Padme Amidala. He loved her the way people love when they have been starved for connection and have finally found someone who sees them fully, with an intensity that felt to him like the truest expression of who he was, and that the Jedi Code made secret and shameful. He married her in secret. He carried the marriage in the private part of himself that was increasingly partitioned from the public role of Jedi Knight, and the partitioning was doing damage that he could not articulate and that no one around him was positioned to see. He was performing Jedi serenity while living a secret life. He was presenting the armor of the Order's training while the interior it was supposed to protect was fracturing along lines he could not name. His mother died in his arms on Tatooine. He had gone to her because he felt her suffering through the Force, had left the mission he was supposed to be on, had found her barely alive in a Tusken Raider camp, had held her as she spoke her last words, and had then done something that the story records with careful restraint but whose weight can be felt in everything that came after. He killed. Not in battle, not in self-defense. In grief and rage, he killed until there was nothing left to kill, and then he sat in the desert and wept and felt the dark side moving through him like cold water through a cracked vessel, finding every fault line, filling every space the training had failed to seal. He told Padme what he had done. He told her he was sorry, he told her he knew it was wrong, and she held him because she loved him, and she understood that the person she loved was also capable of this, and she stayed. This is not a criticism of Padme. Love in the face of the terrible is one of the most human things. But the staying confirmed something in Anakin that the dark side would later use, that love was unconditional, that the people who loved him would forgive the unforgivable, that the terrible thing he had done had not cost him the connection he valued most. He filed that knowledge away somewhere he could not consciously access it. The dark side does not file things consciously. It files them in the body, in the reflex, in the place where you reach for reassurance in the moment of maximum crisis. Sidious watched all of this. He had been watching Anakin since the blockade of Naboo, when the boy arrived on Coruscant with his midi-chlorian count, and his attachment to his mother, and his enormous, barely contained need for someone to tell him he was exceptional and worthy and loved. Sidious understood what the Jedi were not equipped to understand, that the Chosen One's power and the Chosen One's wound were the same door. You did not need to seduce Anakin away from the light. You needed only to wait for the moment when the light asked too much of him, and then be standing in the dark when he reached for something to hold. The Clone Wars gave Anakin everything he needed to become a legend, and everything he needed to become broken. He was a great general. He won battles that should not have been winnable. He saved lives by the thousands. He also witnessed suffering on a scale that the Jedi's doctrine of equanimity was not designed to process without cost, and he processed it by going further, by cutting harder, by holding tighter to the people he loved, by locating his purpose in them, rather than in the Force's larger and more indifferent design. The Jedi Council's decision to give Anakin the rank of Jedi Knight without the full Council's traditional ceremony, and then later to deny him the rank of Master, despite assigning him to the Council as Palpatine's liaison, was not malicious. It was the institutional reflex of a body that was deeply uncomfortable with a situation it could not fully process. Anakin was too powerful, too famous, too publicly identified with the Republic's war effort to be handled through normal channels. He had already exceeded the practical abilities of most masters. Giving him the rank of knight was a way of acknowledging this without the full commitment of mastership. Denying him mastership was a way of maintaining leverage over someone whose loyalty the Council was not entirely certain of. Both of these decisions were defensible as institutional management. Both of them landed on Anakin as rejection, as the confirmation that he was not quite trusted, not quite accepted, not quite the thing the Order wanted him to be despite having built its most visible war hero around him. He talked about this to Palpatine, of course. In the way that people talk about their professional frustrations to the mentor who has always taken their side, who has always affirmed their worth, who has never responded to their complaints with anything but sympathy and validation and gentle encouragement toward the belief that they deserved better than what the institution was giving them. Palpatine listened with the attention of a man who'd been waiting for this exact conversation for 10 years, He did not rush it. He did not push. He simply received and validated and planted, very carefully in the particular way that good manipulators plant, the additional idea that the Jedi's undervaluation of Anakin was not merely institutional conservatism but something more deliberate. That they feared him. That fear was why they withheld the rank. That they were managing him rather than honouring him. The distinction between being managed and being honoured is one that resonates with anyone who has been both. Being managed means being assessed for your usefulness and your risks and being handled accordingly. Being honoured means being seen in your full complexity, valued not for what you can do, but for what you are. Anakin had never been fully honoured, in this sense, by anyone in his life except his mother and Padme. The Jedi had valued his power and his potential, and his usefulness as a general. Palpatine offered something that felt, to Anakin, like the seeing that the Order had withheld. The tragedy is that Palpatine was not seeing him either. He was assessing his vulnerabilities with the clinical thoroughness of a surgeon planning an operation. What felt like being seen was being accurately mapped for future exploitation. The Force visions of Padme's death began approximately 3 months before the end of the Clone Wars. The timing was not coincidental. Sidious could not send the dreams. He could not reach into Anakin's sleeping mind and manufacture images. But he could ensure that the conditions that produce such visions were present. Anakin was exhausted. He had been fighting for 3 years without adequate rest or processing time for what he was experiencing. He was carrying a secret marriage and a secret pregnancy, and the specific weight of someone who has been performing a version of himself that is not quite the full truth for long enough that the performance and the reality have begun to blur. The Force, moving through a mind in that condition, tends to surface the deepest fears in the clearest possible imagery. Palpatine did not send the dreams. He made Anakin the kind of person the Force would send such dreams to, and he made sure he was the person Anakin would tell them to. Padme knew something was wrong in the final months. She was perceptive in the way that people who love someone deeply become perceptive about them, calibrated to the small signals that broadcast what the person is too careful or too proud to say. She saw the exhaustion and the strain and the quality of Anakin's attention in their rare time together, that suggested he was not entirely present. That part of him was always somewhere else, occupied by something he could not bring himself to name to her. She asked. He deflected. She accepted the deflection in the way that people accept deflections when they sense that pressing harder would produce an honesty neither party is ready for. She was afraid for him. She trusted that he would tell her when he was ready. She was out of time. The Battle of Geonosis was the first engagement of the Clone Wars, and it established, in its chaos and its cost and its barely achieved victory, the register of the war that would follow. Expensive, sprawling. Fought on terrain the Republic had not prepared for against an enemy that had been preparing for years. The Jedi who arrived to rescue Obi-Wan became the command structure of an army they had not known existed 48 hours earlier. The clones who deployed from the gunships and hit the arena floor fought with a competence and a coordination that had clearly been developed through years of training that had happened without any Jedi oversight, on a world so remote that the Jedi's ordinary intelligence network had never reached it. Master Yoda, watching the battle from the command ship with the expression of someone absorbing a great deal of information simultaneously, understood several things at once. That the army was extraordinary, that its existence was unexplained, that accepting it was necessary, and that the questions it raised would have to wait for a moment when the questions were not actively competing with blaster fire. The questions waited for 3 years. By the time the war was over and the questions could finally be asked, the army had already served its true purpose, and the asking was moot. By the time the Clone Wars entered their final year, Anakin Skywalker was the most powerful Force user alive outside of Yoda and Sidious himself. He was also exhausted, secretly married, separated from his wife for long deployments, haunted by his mother's death, and beginning to have dreams. Breathe. Let the quiet be wide enough to hold all of that. The story is not over, but the turning point is close. Segment number 6. The Dreams. When prophecy became a weapon. The night is at its deepest now. The world outside has gone quiet in that particular way it only manages in the small hours. A quietness that is not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something older and wider than sound. Rest in it. Let the body be heavy. Let the mind be light. The story will carry you the rest of the way. Anakin Skywalker began dreaming of Padmé's death. This is where the final phase of Sidious's plan began to move. Not in a Senate chamber, not in a military briefing room, but in the private terror of a sleeping man who had already lost his mother and who carried that loss like a wound that had never fully closed. The dreams were vivid. They showed him Padmé dying in childbirth, in pain, in a room he could not locate or reach, surrounded by a darkness he could not dispel. He woke from them sweating, reaching across the bed for her warm presence, holding her while the images faded and the terror slowly loosened its grip. He told her about them. She was calm in the way that Padmé was always calm when Anakin was afraid, not dismissive, but steady. She reminded him that dreams were not prophecy. She reminded him that he was there, that she was there, that the child was healthy and the future was not written. She was right about the future not being written. She was less right about the dreams. The Jedi had a tradition of prophetic dreaming. They called it force visions, glimpses of possible futures filtered through the dreamer's relationship with the Force, shaped by attachment and fear in ways that made them unreliable as literal prediction, but significant as spiritual information. Anakin knew this. He had received some training in interpreting visions. He knew that what he saw was possibility, not certainty. He knew this the way you know things that the terror underneath your knowledge will not let you actually use. Breathe in and slowly out. He went to Yoda. This took courage, the willingness to admit fear to a master whose relationship with fear was the philosophical opposite of his own, whose advice would be the advice of the Jedi doctrine he had always struggled to embody. Yoda listened. Yoda was gentle in his way, and Yoda told him what the Jedi Code required him to tell him, that the fear of loss was itself the path to the dark side, that he must train himself to release his attachment, to grieve what must be grieved before it was lost, to find in the Force's larger continuity a peace that transcended the fates of individual people, however beloved. This was not wrong advice in the abstract. But for Anakin Skywalker, in the specific crucible of that specific moment, it landed as abandonment. He went to his master with his fear and his love and his desperate need for someone to tell him that Padmé would be safe, and what he received was a philosophical reorientation toward the acceptance of her death. The Jedi were asking him to practice in real time on the thing he valued most, the very non-attachment he had never been able to genuinely achieve. He left the conversation alone in a way that he had not been alone when he entered it. Sidious had been cultivating their relationship for years by this point. The Chancellor and the Jedi Knight. The mentor and the brilliant young protege who was being given by the Chancellor's office the kind of personal attention and frank acknowledgement of his greatness that the Jedi Council had always been too reserved to provide. Sidious praised him. Sidious told him things the Council withheld. He treated Anakin as an equal rather than a student, as someone whose power had already exceeded the traditional structures of the Order's hierarchy, as someone who deserved recognition rather than further cultivation. He was filling, with great precision, the exact shape of the need that the Jedi's reserve had left empty. When Anakin came to him with the dreams, Sidious was ready. He had been ready for years. He did not offer Sidious's advice or Palpatine's advice, or the dark side's advice. He offered a friend's advice, the gentle, concerned, personal counsel of a man who cared about Anakin specifically, who wanted him to be well, who had been worried about him, who was glad he had come. And then, after the relationship of the moment had been fully established, after Anakin was fully present and receiving and open, Sidious mentioned something. He had been researching ancient Force traditions. He had come across something remarkable. There was said to be a power in the dark side, a power that Plagueis, his old friend and mentor, had been on the verge of discovering. The power to prevent death, the power to keep the people you loved alive. Sit with the precision of that. Not the power to destroy your enemies, not the power to win the war, the power to save the person you love, targeted to the exact wound with the exactitude of a surgeon who has spent years studying the patient. Anakin did not become Darth Vader that day. The conversion was not a single moment. It was a series of moments, a slow tilting, a gradual displacement of one set of loyalties by another. but the conversation about Plagueis' power planted something that the dreams were watering every night, that Padme's pregnancy was making more urgent every day, that the Jedi's inability to help him was making more available every time he left one of their conversations feeling emptier than when he had entered it. The Jedi sent him to spy on the Chancellor. This was the final insult, or the final straw, depending on how you understand it. They asked Anakin Skywalker, whose primary loyalty was not to the Jedi Order but to the people he loved, and who was already half convinced that the Chancellor was someone worth trusting, to report the Chancellor's private conversations back to the Council. They were asking him to betray the man who had offered him the only hope he had been given for Padme's life. They were asking him to choose between them. Anakin's assignment to spy on Palpatine was the Jedi Council's most significant tactical error, and it was an error born from the Council's consistent misunderstanding of who Anakin Skywalker actually was. They knew he had a relationship with the Chancellor. They knew the Chancellor valued him. What they failed to appreciate, or chose not to appreciate because the full appreciation of it would have required them to acknowledge their own failure to serve him, was that the relationship with Palpatine existed in the space the Jedi had left empty. You do not ask someone to surveil the person who is filling the void you created. You do not expect loyalty to the institution from someone who feels, with considerable justification, that the institution has failed to be loyal to him. Anakin was honest with them, or partially honest, which is the honesty available to someone who is carrying more than he has been given the tools to carry. He told them it felt wrong. He told them it would damage his relationship with the Chancellor and undermine his effectiveness as the Council's liaison. He told them, in the language available to a man who could not fully access his own emotional truth, that what they were asking had a quality he could not quite name but could not ignore. The Council heard the objection and explained why it was overridden. They were not wrong in their reasoning. They simply did not understand that the conversation had already told Anakin everything he needed to know about where he stood with them. Mace Windu's role in the final crisis is the most contested element in how the story is told afterward. His decision to execute the Chancellor rather than bring him to trial, made in the moment of apparent victory with Sidious, apparently defeated and helpless at the point of his blade, is interpreted in several ways depending on who is doing the interpreting and what they need the story to mean. Some say Mace was right. A Sith Lord of Palpatine's power and political influence could not be safely imprisoned, would corrupt any trial, would find allies to effect his release, and the only certain way to end the threat was to end the man. Others say the decision to execute rather than try was itself a dark side action, that taking justice into your own hands, deciding that the rules apply to everyone except the person in front of you right now, is precisely the kind of thinking the Jedi were supposed to oppose. Both of these readings are serious. Neither of them is complete. What is not in serious dispute is that Sidious was not helpless. The apparent weakness, the disfigured face, the trembling body, the cry for Anakin's intervention, was a performance as calculated as everything else he had ever done. He could have defeated Mace. He chose not to, because being defeated in that moment in front of Anakin was more useful than winning. He needed Anakin to see a man in need of saving. He needed to activate in Anakin's reflexes the response that 3 years of military command had drilled into him. Protect the vulnerable. Save who you can. Never let another person die when action is available. Sidious weaponized Anakin's compassion. He turned a virtue into the instrument of everything the virtue was supposed to prevent. The nights that followed the duel on Mustafar, the nights during which Darth Vader existed and Anakin Skywalker did not yet know whether Padme had survived, were the darkest period of the transition, the time when the new identity was most completely in control, and the old one was buried deepest. Sidious filled those nights with purpose, with missions, with the constant motion that prevents a person from having to stop and inhabit the consequences of what they have done. He gave Vader enemies to defeat, and orders to follow, and a galaxy to remake because stillness was dangerous. Stillness was where Anakin lived, and Anakin was a problem to be managed until the armor and the breathing and the 20 years of dark side practice had changed him sufficiently that Anakin was no longer accessible even in stillness. The name itself was part of the architecture, Darth Vader. A new name creates a new person, or attempts to, replaces the old map of the self with a new one, gives the body a different identity to perform, allows the person to locate their actions in a history that is different from the one that came before the name change. It is a tool with a long history and traditions of radical self-transformation, used by monks and soldiers and revolutionaries, and anyone who needs to mark the boundary between who they were and who they are becoming. Sidious understood the psychology of it. The name was not merely a title. It was a reorientation of the self toward an identity that had no mother, no wife, no Jedi training, no history of attachment, an identity built from the dark side up, without the old life's fingerprints. Padmé's pregnancy changed the emotional mathematics of everything in the final months of the Clone Wars. Anakin was going to be a father. The child that was coming, the children, as it turned out, though they did not know this yet, represented a future that was entirely his, entirely theirs, a continuation of themselves into the world that had nothing to do with the war or the Jedi or the politics of the Republic. He held this knowledge with the same desperate grip he held everything he loved, completely, without the reserve the Jedi required, with the full weight of a person who has never learned to love at a distance. The pregnancy made Padmé's death more vivid to him in the dreams, not less. It gave the loss a specific shape, not merely Padmé gone, but Padmé and everything she carried gone, the future unmade, the continuation severed. He dreamed this with a clarity that the Force's visions sometimes produce, the specific detail of a particular future, shown in sufficient resolution that it takes on the quality of memory rather than imagination. He woke from these dreams in a state that Padmé described, in her private journal, as barely reachable, present in body but absent in the way that people are absent when they are living in a place the body has not yet gone. He chose wrong, and he knew it was wrong, and he chose it anyway, because the dream of her dying would not stop, and the man who claimed to know how to stop it was still alive, and as long as that man was alive, the possibility existed that Padmé would survive what the Force was showing Anakin in his sleep. Rest now. The weight of this is real. But you are safe in the dark, and the breath is steady, and the next part of the story will find you here when you are ready for it. Segment number 7. The Fall. One night on Coruscant that changed everything. Breathe in slowly and out. The body is resting well and the mind is light and loose, floating in that comfortable space between waking and sleeping where the stories reach you most easily. Stay there. Let the voice carry you. It happened in a single night. That is the thing that is hardest to absorb when you look at it closely. That the turning point of the entire Star Wars saga, the moment when a Jedi Knight became a Sith Lord and the Republic began its final collapse into Empire, unfolded across the span of a few hours in a city that was sleeping while it happened. Mace Windu had gone to arrest the Chancellor. He took 3 of the finest Jedi Masters the Order had with him, because Anakin had finally told him what he had been keeping, that Chancellor Palpatine was a Sith Lord. The revelation was seismic. After the years of searching, after the decades of feeling a disturbance in the Force that they could not locate, the Sith Lord was the man they had been working beside and deferring to and allowing to accumulate power for the last decade. The Council's response was immediate, because there was no time for deliberation. If Palpatine knew they knew, he would act before they could. Mace went directly. He found Sidious in his office. The confrontation was brief and violent and ended with Sidious apparently cornered, the Sith Lord revealed, his lightsaber defeated, Mace Windu holding him at the point of a purple blade with the weary certainty of someone who has just confirmed the worst thing he ever suspected about the world he thought he understood. Palpatine was helpless, defeated. The threat was over. Breathe slowly. This is the hinge on which everything turned. Then Anakin walked in. He had followed Mace. He could not stay away because everything he needed was in that room. Padmé's only hope was the Sith Lord's knowledge, and if Mace killed the Sith Lord before Anakin could extract that knowledge, Padmé would die. He stood in the doorway and watched Mace prepare to deliver the killing blow, and Sidious, that ancient, patient genius of manipulation, said the thing he had been saving for this exact moment. He called out to Anakin. He said he was too weak to save himself. He said only Anakin could save him. He said that if Anakin let Mace strike him down, the knowledge of preventing death would die with him. Anakin severed Mace Windu's hand. In the fraction of a second it took for the blade to fall, and Mace Windu to lose his weapon, and Sidious to unleash the Force lightning that threw him out of the window into the Coruscant night, Anakin Skywalker crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He had attacked a Jedi Master. He had done it in defense of a Sith Lord. He had done it consciously, with full knowledge of what Palpatine was, and the doing of it meant that whatever he had been before that moment, he was something different now. He knew it immediately. He said it himself, kneeling in the office while the body of Mace Windu fell toward the city far below. What have I done? 3 words. Not a question, exactly. A recognition. Sidious moved immediately because he had been planning this conversation for years, and he understood that the window between what Anakin had done and what Anakin would do next was very small. He told him there was no going back. He told him the Jedi would never forgive this. He told him that his only path forward, his only path to Padmé's survival, was through the dark side, through the power Plagueis had discovered, through the new order that they would build together. He gave him a new name, Darth Vader, and Anakin Skywalker knelt. It is important to hold what he was feeling in that moment, because the story is sometimes told in ways that make it seem inevitable, as though Anakin's fall was written into him from the beginning, as though the dark side's pull was irresistible, as though the outcome could not have been otherwise. None of these framings are quite true. Anakin made choices. He made them in circumstances of enormous psychological pressure, under manipulation so skilled it barely looked like manipulation, in the grip of a terror about losing Padmé that had been carefully cultivated and aimed. But he made them. He chose. And one of the things the story is about is what it means that someone who loved as genuinely as Anakin Skywalker loved could make those choices. What it means that love, when it is driven by fear rather than by trust, can be the instrument of the very destruction it was trying to prevent. He was sent to the Jedi Temple while Sidious transmitted the activation signal to every clone trooper in the Grand Army of the Republic. He was sent to eliminate the Jedi who remained there. He was told this was necessary. He was told the Jedi were traitors to the Republic. He was told many things in the hours that followed, and he accepted them not because he believed them, but because believing them was the only available alternative to looking directly at what he had done and who he had become, and that was something he could not yet do. The signal went out across the galaxy. Clone commanders received it on every front of every battle the Clone Wars were fighting. It reached them in the middle of combat and in the quiet of command ships, and on the bridge of cruisers and in the dust of alien worlds, where Jedi and clones had been fighting side by side for 3 years. The architecture of Order 66 as a piece of engineering is worth understanding before examining its execution. Sidious had been planning the eventual elimination of the Jedi since long before the Clone Wars began. The clone army was always intended as the instrument, from the moment he arranged the commission through the dead Jedi Sifo Dyas. The army's ultimate purpose was this one. Every battle they fought, every victory they achieved, every relationship of trust and brotherhood they built with their Jedi generals across 3 years of war, was preparation for the moment when the trust would be inverted. The deeper the trust, the more complete the inversion would be. A clone army that had never been close to the Jedi would have been a less reliable weapon against them. The closeness was a feature. The inhibitor chip program was the technical solution to the moral problem that arises when you intend to use soldiers who are, demonstrably, people capable of forming genuine loyalty. Clones who had spent 3 years fighting beside Jedi generals did not, left to their own agency, want to kill those generals. The chip did not override a mere preference. It overrode a considered moral position, a loyalty with history and texture, and specific memories attached to it. Commander Rex had covered for General Skywalker in more scrapes than he could count. Commander Cody had argued tactics with General Kenobi over campfires on a dozen worlds. These were not superficial working relationships. They were something more than that, in the way that relationships formed under genuine danger always tend towards something more than professional. The chip was necessary, precisely because what it was overriding was real. Ahsoka Tano was not with the Order when Order 66 executed. She had left the Jedi before its end, walked away from the Council that had accused her of a crime she did not commit, been exonerated by the confession of the actual perpetrator, and then offered reinstatement in terms that made it clear the Council still did not fully trust her. She declined. She was not present in the temple when Vader arrived. She was not present on any of the battlefields where her former colleagues died under their own troops' weapons. She survived Order 66 not through exceptional combat skill or providential rescue, but through the particular mercy of absence, of having already been pushed out of the institution that was being destroyed. Her absence was its own kind of loss, She carried it for the rest of her life, the knowledge that she might have been there, that she chose to leave before she understood what she was leaving before. The Jedi who died on distant battlefields were not, with a few exceptions, told what was happening before it happened. This is an important distinction. Order 66 was not a confrontation. It was not a battle between two sides who understood themselves to be opposing each other. It was an ambush. And what made it an ambush in the deepest sense was not merely the surprise of the weapons raised, but the totality of the betrayal. The clones who raised those weapons were not enemies. They had never been enemies. Every Jedi who died in those moments died in a state of complete confusion about what was happening to them, because the possibility that their own troops would turn against them had been specifically and deliberately made unthinkable by 3 years of shared suffering and shared survival. There were places in the galaxy where the execution was messier, where circumstances produced warning, or where individual clone commanders felt the chip's activation with enough subjective awareness to hesitate for a fraction of a second, not long enough to resist, but long enough for a force sensitive with quick enough reflexes to catch the change in intention before the blaster was fully raised. These fraction of a second warnings were what saved Obi-Wan on Utapau and Yoda on Kashyyyk, and a small number of other Jedi across the galaxy who felt the shift in the clones they were standing next to and acted on the feeling before they understood it. The Force, in those moments, was doing what the Jedi had always said it would do, warning those sensitive enough to listen. The problem was that most of the Jedi who died in Order 66 were sensitive enough to listen. They simply did not receive the warning in time, because the chip's effect on clone physiology was rapid enough that the change from trusted companion to lethal threat occupied an interval shorter than the nervous system's capacity to process and respond. In the years immediately following Order 66, the survivors developed a particular kind of hypervigilance that was the opposite of the Jedi's trained openness. They flinched at things that did not require flinching. They trusted people more slowly and with more reservation than they had before. They were practicing in their bodies and their reflexes the inverse of what the Order had taught, had been forced to learn that the people you most trusted were the people most capable of the worst harm. This is a teaching that the dark side of the Force, or the people who act through it, does its work by imprinting. It makes the world smaller and colder and more suspicious. It harvests the openness of the light side and replaces it with the particular kind of vigilance that looks like wisdom from the outside, and feels like damage from the inside. The night before Order 66, Obi-Wan left Coruscant for Utapau. He said goodbye to Anakin in a corridor of the temple, a brief exchange slightly awkward in the way that all significant goodbyes between people who have not said what they mean to each other tend to be awkward, and boarded the cruiser that would take him to the battle he'd been assigned. He would later say that he felt something in that corridor. Not a Force vision, not a premonition with specific content, but a quality of weight that he recognized in retrospect as the Force marking the significance of the moment without explaining it. He had felt this kind of weight before Qui-Gon's death, before the first battle of Geonosis, at other turning points that he recognized as turning points only once they had turned. He noted the feeling and set it aside because the work required his full attention and the feeling had no actionable content. He went to Utapau, he found General Grievous, he fought, and the battle was going well, and then Commander Cody transmitted the order and the world changed while Obi-Wan was falling into water that had no idea it was about to become part of history. It said only a number, Order 66, and the clones turned. Let that weight be still. Let the breath move through it slowly. The night holds it. You are safe inside the telling. Segment number 8, Order 66, the night the Jedi died. The breath is slow and even. You are resting well. Let the weight of the body be complete. Let every part of it release into the surface beneath you. Let the dark of the room be soft and close. Let the voice be the only thing moving in the quiet. Follow it gently into the story's darkest night. Order 66 was one of a series of contingency orders that had been written into the Clone Army's operational programming from the beginning. The clones knew of its existence the way soldiers know of standing orders, as a procedural fact, neither examined nor questioned, filed under the category of things that are true without being relevant until they are. Order 66 stated that if the Jedi Order was determined to have committed treason against the Republic, clone troopers were to execute all Jedi without question or hesitation. The programming went deeper than the Order itself. This is what makes Order 66 more than simply a command that was followed. The Kaminoans had built into every clone a biological implant, a small device near the base of the brain, introduced during growth, invisible in standard medical scans, dormant until activation. When the order was transmitted, the implant did not merely remind the clone of a standing directive. It enforced compliance at a level beneath conscious resistance. The clones who turned on their Jedi generals were not, in the full moral sense, choosing to turn. The choice had been made for them at the cellular level, years before the moment of execution, by people whose names the clones would never know. There was one clone who knew, CT-7567, Commander Rex. Years later, after the war, after he had the implant removed and had time to process what had been done to him, said that the moment of activation felt like a door closing somewhere in the mind. Not pain, just closure. A narrowing of the possible into the single certain thing. He was one of the few who survived with the knowledge intact, who had to carry what he had done with the full weight of understanding that the doing had been arranged rather than chosen. Breathe. Let the sadness of that be what it is. Across the galaxy, on dozens of worlds simultaneously, Jedi generals turned to find their troops raising weapons. Ki-Adi-Mundi on Mijieto, mid-sentence in a battle command, surrounded by clones who had followed his orders without question for 3 years. Aayla Secura on Felucia, in a green forest whose beauty had nothing to say about what was happening in it. Plo Koon in his starfighter above Cato Nemoidia, where the clones' attack meant the destruction of the aircraft rather than the raising of a blaster. They shot him from the sky as he flew, and he fell, and the fire below swallowed him without ceremony. Commander Cody on Utapau, following the order against Obi-Wan Kenobi, who had just spoken with him minutes before, who had trusted him, who fell into the water below the sinkhole and survived by the particular stubbornness that had characterized his entire career. They died the way the vulnerable die when the institutions that protect them are turned against them, not in the heroic confrontation that their training prepared them for, but in the sudden reversal of trust, in the moment when the known thing became the lethal thing, in the fraction of a second between the raising of a weapon and the understanding of what was happening. Some of them fought. Most did not survive the fight. They had not been trained to distrust the people beside them. The Jedi doctrine of connection to the living force had disposed them toward openness rather than suspicion. And in the galaxy Sidious had built, openness was the last vulnerability he needed to exploit. On Coruscant, in the Jedi Temple that had stood for thousands of years as the center of the Order's life, Darth Vader arrived. The records of what happened inside are fragmentary and indirect. Survivors described hearing sounds, seeing smoke, watching the building's lights fail one by one as the night wore on. The temple had been a living place, full of younglings and Padawans and masters and the constant quiet motion of an institution going about its work. By morning it was not, and in the Senate chamber Palpatine addressed the representatives of 1,000 worlds with the voice of a man who had barely survived a terrible betrayal. He was still marked from the confrontation with Mace. The lightning that Mace had partially reflected had left him disfigured, the flesh of his face drawn and twisted, the eyes yellow with the dark side's corruption now undisguised. He presented this not as evidence of his nature, but as evidence of the Jedi's treachery. He said they had attempted to assassinate him. He said the war had been their doing. He said the Republic was in danger, that the democratic systems that had sustained it for 1,000 years were no longer adequate to the threats the galaxy faced, and that extraordinary measures were required. He said, in order to ensure the security and continuing stability, the Republic will be reorganized into the First Galactic Empire. The Senate applauded, not unanimously, but with enough of the enthusiasm that comes from exhaustion and relief, and the desire for strong leadership after a long and terrible war to fill the chamber with sound. Padme Amidala, sitting in that chamber, said the words that have outlasted everything else from that moment. So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause. The Emperor's speech to the Senate following Order 66 was the culmination of a career's worth of public communication practice. Every carefully worded Senate address, every press conference during the Clone Wars, every personal conversation in which the mask of Palpatine had been maintained and refined across decades of performance. He did not read from prepared remarks in that chamber. He spoke from memory, from the architecture of an argument he had been building since before the Clone Wars began, about the failure of the Republic's institutions to protect its citizens, about the need for strength in the face of enemies who did not respect weakness, about the painful but necessary transformation of the democratic structure into something that could actually provide the security the galaxy required. The applause he received was not manufactured. This is the detail that most unsettles people when they examine it closely. The senators who applauded the end of the Republic were not coerced in that moment. They were not under the influence of forced suggestion. They were responding to an argument they found, in the exhausted and frightened state that 3 years of war had produced in them, genuinely persuasive. They were trading something they had taken for granted, the institutional architecture of a democratic republic, for something that felt more immediate and more concrete: safety, stability, the end of a war that had been killing people across the galaxy for years. The transaction felt reasonable. It felt like a necessary adjustment. It felt like the kind of hard choice that serious people make in difficult times. That is what made it irreversible. Coerced choices can be retracted. Freely made choices, even terrible ones, live in the person who made them as their own. Bail Organa was one of the senators who did not applaud. He sat in his seat and watched the chamber express its enthusiasm for the birth of the Empire, and his face in the historical record shows the expression of someone who understands exactly what is being lost and who cannot stop it. He had already set in motion the conversations that would eventually become the Rebel Alliance, had already reached out to Mon Mothma of Chandrila, had already arranged the rescue of both Obi-Wan and Yoda, had already taken Padme's daughter into his household to raise as his own. He was not passive in the face of what was happening. He was beginning, in the only way available to him, the long and painful and extremely dangerous project of reversing what the Senate had just celebrated. The Emperor's reorganization of the Republic into the Empire was not accomplished in the speech alone. The speech was the declaration of intent. The institutional transformation took months of legal and bureaucratic work. The judicial department restructured, the clone army expanded and eventually supplemented by an enlisted imperial military. The Senate's powers systematically reduced from genuine governance to rubber stamp approval of decisions already made in the Emperor's office. The emergency powers that had been repeatedly renewed during the Clone Wars simply never returned to their pre-emergency state. Each individual step was defensible in isolation. The cumulative effect was the replacement of a 1,000-year-old democratic system with personal autocracy. The galaxy noticed the end state without ever having been presented with a clear moment at which to object to any individual step along the way. Darth Vader's assault on the Jedi Temple is the most viscerally distressing element of Order 66, precisely because the Temple was not a military target in any meaningful sense. The clones on the battlefields were responding to a military emergency, however falsely premised. The Temple was a home. It was a school. It was the place where children were brought when the Force was identified in them, where they grew up in the particular community of people who understood what they were, where the accumulated wisdom of 25,000 years of Jedi practice was housed in the archives and in the training dojos and in the masters who walked its corridors. Vader went there as someone who had grown up in that community, who had been brought there as a boy, who had learned everything he knew about himself as a Force user within those walls. He went there as someone who knew what he was destroying, and he did it anyway, and the doing of it was the final sealing of the new identity against the old one. What the Temple's destruction accomplished, beyond the obvious, was the elimination of the Jedi's institutional memory. The archives housed records going back to the Order's founding, holocrons made by ancient masters, medical and historical and scientific records accumulated across millennia, the full library of Force knowledge that the Order had built through 25,000 years of practice and discovery. Some of this was recovered or preserved, most of it was not. The galaxy that emerged from Order 66 was a galaxy with a gap in its own history, a gap shaped like 25,000 years of knowledge about the Force's light side, available now only in fragments, in the memories of survivors, in the hidden holocrons that individual Jedi had kept or concealed in the years before the Purge found them. The medical droids who attended Padme's death on the Polis Massa facility were not equipped to process what they observed. A woman in perfect physical health, carrying 2 viable children, whose vital signs were nonetheless declining, with the unhurried certainty of a person who has made a decision. She was not ill. She was not injured beyond the bruising that her encounter with Vader had produced. She was dying of something the medical instruments could not measure. Dying, as the lead droid reported to Bail Organa with the careful precision of a system that could record findings without interpreting them, of a broken heart. The twins were delivered safely. She named them Luke, Leia, and she said what she had left to say to Obi-Wan, who held her hand while the instruments quietly documented the failing, and she died before the sun had risen on the facility's artificial day cycle. The children she left behind knew nothing of this, of course. Luke would grow up knowing only that his mother had died, unspecified, when he was very young. Leia would remember something, a feeling rather than a memory, warmth and sadness and a sense of beauty that she could not attach to any specific image. The Force carries what the conscious mind cannot hold. She carried her mother in it for the rest of her life without knowing whose warmth she was carrying. She was right, and she was present for it, and she had loved the man who made it possible and was carrying his children and would die before she could know what those children would eventually mean for the galaxy that had just lost its freedom. Rest here. Let the breath be slow and full. The worst has happened in the story. But the worst is never the end of the story. That is what the story has been trying to say since the beginning, and it will say it again before it is finished. Segment number 9. The Survivors. What remained when the smoke cleared? You are still here. The body is resting and the breath is slow and the dark of the room is soft and complete. There is no urgency tonight. There is only the story, moving through the quiet toward its last chapters. Let it come. Let it find you exactly where you are. Not all the Jedi died in Order 66. This is not a small fact. It is the fact that the rest of the story depends on, and it is worth dwelling in for a moment before the darkness of the purge sweeps it away. Some survived, not many, but some. And the manner of their survival tells you something about the Force. Something about what the Force does in the moments when every visible institution has been destroyed and only the invisible currents remain. Yoda was on Kashyyyk when the Order came. He felt it before the blasters were raised. Felt the deaths of Jedi across the galaxy as a wave of cold through the Force, each distinct absence joining the others into something so large it was almost beyond processing. He had been standing in the forest with the Wookiees, and then the clones turned, and he did what 900 years of discipline in the Force had prepared him to do. He acted without hesitation, with the full presence and the full economy of someone for whom the Force's guidance in a crisis is not a philosophical position, but a lived and embodied reflex. He killed the clones who were killing him, and he escaped, and he went to Coruscant, and he walked into the temple that was still burning, and he found in the records what had been done. He went to the Senate building. He went to find Sidious. This was not arrogance. It was the assessment of a very old and very honest mind about what was possible and what was necessary. He fought the Emperor, fought him to something approaching a draw which no one else in the Order could have managed. And then he ran. He retreated. He acknowledged that the galaxy was not ready for the Jedi to win this fight. That the conditions required for the light side's victory did not yet exist. That they needed time. Breathe gently. There is something in this that is worth sitting with. The most powerful Jedi alive running from a fight he could not win, choosing the humility of retreat over the certainty of noble defeat. This is wisdom the story does not always get credit for. Yoda had spent his life teaching that the Force moved in its own time and required patience from its servants. When the moment came to demonstrate that teaching in the most expensive possible way, he did it. Obi-Wan Kenobi survived on Utapau, retrieved from the water by Senator Bail Organa, who was already forming in his mind the shape of what would eventually become the rebellion. Obi-Wan was given the hardest task. Not exile, though exile came. Not hiding, though hiding followed. He was given a mission. He went to Mustafar, where Darth Vader was continuing the work Sidious had assigned him, and he found what Anakin had become. The duel on Mustafar is one of the most important conversations in the saga, conducted in violence because violence was the only language available to it. They had been master and student, then brothers, then general and commander, and now they were on opposite sides of the line that separated the living force from the dark side, and the line was not a metaphor. It was a physical thing, present in every movement they made. Obi-Wan wept during it. This is noted in the accounts that survive, that the man who had trained Anakin, who had watched him grow from a frightened boy into the most powerful Jedi of his generation, who had loved him with the reserved and often inadequate love that the Jedi doctrine permitted, was weeping while he fought. He told Anakin he loved him at the end. When it was over, and Anakin was burning on the edge of the lava, and the battle was finished and there was nothing left to say that mattered except that, he did not kill him. He left. He took Luke, the son born in the hours after the duel, while Padme was dying from a broken heart on a medical ship in orbit. She was told she had lost the will to live, and this is true in a way that the medical language barely captures, because what Padme had lost was not life force in any abstract sense, but the specific future she had been building, the one that contained Anakin and their children, and a republic worth believing in. And Obi-Wan took the boy to Tatooine, to the uncle who would raise him, and then went into the desert to wait. To wait for what specifically, Obi-Wan probably could not have fully articulated. He went to wait the way you go to wait when you know that the hour has not yet come and you cannot make it come, and you cannot see its shape clearly, but you know with the deep knowledge that the Force plants in those willing to receive it, that the hour will come, that the darkness does not last, that the children being hidden on their separate worlds, Luke in the desert, Leia with the senator from Alderaan, were not simply being kept safe from an emperor. They were being kept safe for a galaxy that was going to need them. The survivors scattered. Some went into exile, some went underground, living in the galaxy as ordinary people, their lightsabers hidden and their Force sensitivity suppressed to the level of background noise that the Emperor's Inquisitors would not detect. Some died in the years of the purge that followed Order 66, hunted by the Inquisitorium that Vader led with the particular thoroughness of a man who was determined to eliminate every reminder of what he had destroyed. He killed Jedi because Sidious required it, and he killed them because they were witnesses, and he killed them because looking away from them was the only strategy available to someone who had not yet found the capacity to look directly at what he had done. Caleb Dume was 14 years old when Order 66 happened. He survived because his master, Depa Billaba, threw herself between him and the clones, holding them back long enough for him to run. He ran. He left his master to die, which was what she told him to do, which was the act of love available to her in that moment, the gift of his survival purchased at the cost of her own. He ran and he kept running for years, changing his name to Kanan Jarrus and hiding the lightsaber and suppressing the Force sensitivity that would have drawn the Inquisitors to him, and not using any of what he'd been taught until the moment came when someone else's need was greater than his caution. His story is one of hundreds of variations on the same basic structure. Survived by accident or by another's sacrifice, went underground, lived as something other than a Jedi for as long as the alternative was bearable, eventually returned to the tradition not because the Empire became less dangerous, but because the tradition required it. Each survivor's return to the Force had its own specific catalyst. Some returned when they found someone Force-sensitive who needed training. Some returned when the suffering they witnessed exceeded the limit of what passive concealment could tolerate. Some returned because the Force found them, because the current of the living world, patient across the years of their hiding, eventually moved in them in a way they could no longer pretend was not happening. Ahsoka Tano's return to active engagement happened through Bail Organa and the early rebellion. She operated under the name Fulcrum, an intelligence identity, deliberately stripped of the personal, a name that described a function rather than a person. She gathered information and passed it to rebel cells that did not know who she was, maintaining the same operational security that the surviving Jedi had developed as their primary survival mechanism. She was effective and careful, and deeply reluctant to use the Force skills she had spent her teenage years developing, because using them attracted attention, and attention attracted the Inquisitors, and the Inquisitors attracted Vader, and Vader was the one enemy in the galaxy she was not ready to face. She faced him eventually. On Malachor, in the ruins of an ancient Sith temple, they confronted each other for the first time since the night of Order 66. She had suspected for years. She had felt something in the Force when she came close to Vader, a familiar signature beneath the dark side's corruption, a shape she recognized before she was ready to name what she was recognizing. When she finally confirmed it, when the mask was cracked and she saw the eye beneath, and felt the presence she had known since she was 14 years old, what she felt by her own later account was not grief but a kind of clarity. The thing she had been afraid to know was now known. The not knowing had been, in some ways, harder. Obi-Wan's 20 years on Tatooine are the most misunderstood period of his life, because they look from the outside like waiting, and from the inside they were something considerably more active. He was in communication with Qui-Gon's Force Ghost, his former master, who had discovered after his death the technique of maintaining individual consciousness within the Force, the first Jedi in the modern order to do so, and who had been guiding Obi-Wan from across the threshold ever since. He was continuing his own Force training in methods that the Order had not previously sanctioned, learning from a tradition older than the Temple's records, preparing himself for conversations with Luke that would need to convey in a few weeks what normally took years of formal instruction. He was also simply watching Luke. This is not a small thing. He watched a boy grow up on a desert farm, watched the Force moving in him with the same quality he had seen in the boy's father at the same age, watched the restlessness and the talent and the need for something larger than the horizon his uncle was trying to keep him behind. He watched and he did not intervene, because the timing was not right and Luke was not ready, and the Force had not moved in the way that indicated the hour had come. When it finally moved, when Leia's message arrived and the droids appeared, and Luke came to the cave in the Jundland Wastes, Obi-Wan recognized the hour not because he had been waiting for it, but because the Force made it unmistakable. This was different from the waiting. This was the arriving. The Imperial Inquisitorius was Vader's instrument and Sidious's design. A core of dark side Force users, many of them former Jedi who had been captured and turned rather than killed, deployed to hunt the survivors who had escaped Order 66. Their existence served two purposes. The obvious purpose was elimination, finding the remaining Jedi and removing them from the galaxy's equation. The less obvious purpose was demonstration, showing the Force-sensitive population of the galaxy that the Jedi were not merely defeated but actively persecuted, that the old tradition was not merely gone but being dismantled piece by piece, that anyone who associated themselves with it was inviting the specific and personal attention of people who had been the tradition and knew how to find what was hiding inside it. The Inquisitors were the Empire's message to the Force-sensitive. Your path leads to us, or it leads to death, and we are the only path available to you now. Most Force-sensitive children identified in those years were brought to the Empire rather than hidden. Their parents were told it was an honor. It was the most efficient conversion of the Jedi Order's legacy into Imperial assets that Sidious could have designed, because it required the parents' cooperation and received it. Rest in the quiet of this. The galaxy is under the Empire now. The Jedi are gone or hiding. Two children are being raised in secret on opposite ends of the galaxy by people who love them and who carry in the keeping the entire weight of what the galaxy might still become. The hope is very small. The darkness is very large. This is where the story leaves us before the next chapter begins. Sleep toward that hope. It is small, but it is real, and small real things have a way of becoming exactly what the story needed all along. Segment number 10, The Long Shadow. What Order 66 really destroyed and what it could not. You have come so far tonight, through the boy on Naboo and the 1,000 years of shadow that preceded him, through the manufactured crisis and the engineered war and the dreams that were aimed like weapons at a young man's most unguarded place, through the single night that ended 1,000 years of the Jedi Order and began the long darkness of the Empire. You have followed the whole story, and the whole story is now here, in the last chapter, in the quiet before the sleep takes you completely. We're going to stay with what Order 66 actually destroyed, not the buildings. The temple was rebuilt eventually in a different form for a different purpose, not the lightsabers. They persisted in hidden places in the hands of the survivors, and eventually in the hands of their students. What Order 66 destroyed was something harder to name and harder to rebuild. It destroyed a tradition of living with the Force that had been accumulating for 25,000 years. 25,000 years. Say that slowly. The Jedi Order was older than the Republic by a considerable margin. It predated writing in some of the galaxy's civilizations. It had seen the rise and fall of empires, the emergence and extinction of species, the long geological changes of worlds. It had made errors across those millennia, serious errors, errors the story examines honestly, errors that were part of what made Anakin's fall possible. The doctrine of non-attachment that could not hold what Anakin carried. The institutional confidence that could not see the darkness growing in the Chancellor's office. the tendency to treat the Force as a thing to be managed rather than a living relationship to be entered. These errors were real, but the wisdom was also real. The meditation practices and the combat disciplines and the philosophy of service and the accumulated understanding of how the Force moved through living things. These were genuine achievements of the long tradition, and they were destroyed with the same thoroughness that destroyed everything else when the clones turned. Breathe. Let the enormity of that loss be felt rather than analysed. What the Emperor understood that he did not advertise was that the Jedi's greatest power was not the lightsabers or the Force abilities. It was the institution, the millennia of transmission, master to Padawan, one generation giving the next what it had learned. The living chain of the knowledge that is the only mechanism by which accumulated wisdom survives the deaths of individuals. Break the chain anywhere, and you lose everything after the break. The Purge was designed to break the chain at every link simultaneously, across the whole galaxy, leaving no master who could train a Padawan, no Padawan who could become a master, no tradition that could continue itself. It nearly worked. For 20 years it nearly worked. The Emperor sat in his throne room and watched the galaxy through the dark side of the Force, and felt the Jedi presence diminishing to almost nothing. A few old survivors in hiding, Force-sensitive children being raised without training, the living current of the tradition running thinner and thinner toward what he intended to be its end. He missed two things. He missed the boy on Tatooine, who was hiding in plain sight with his uncle's moisture farm and his restlessness and his father's talent in the Force. And he missed the fact that Obi-Wan Kenobi, living in a cave in the Junlan wastes, was not simply waiting for the darkness to end, but was preparing, studying, practicing, communicating through methods the Emperor did not monitor, keeping the tradition alive in the smallest possible form across the 20 years until the boy was ready. Luke Skywalker did not restore the Jedi Order. That story is more complicated and more honest than Restoration, because the order that existed before Order 66 was not a thing that could simply be reconstituted. What Luke rebuilt, or began to rebuild, in the few years he had before everything changed again, was something that learned from its predecessors' errors, something that took seriously the price that non-attachment had demanded from Anakin Skywalker, something that was trying to find the version of the Jedi tradition that could hold both the discipline and the love, that could honour the Force without the spiritual arrogance that comes from believing you understand it fully. He also saved his father. This is the part of the story that Palpatine's grand plan had not accounted for, because Palpatine had never loved anyone, and therefore could not model what love was capable of. He believed that Vader was fully his, that the Anakin Skywalker who had burned on Mustafar was gone, that what remained was the useful instrument he had shaped from the wreckage. He was wrong. What remained was also a father. What remained also felt when his son came to face him, something that the dark side of the Force had buried very deep but had not managed to destroy. The stubborn, inconvenient, theologically awkward truth that love, when it is genuine, does not fully die. Vader chose his son over his master at the moment that mattered. He died doing it. And the prophecy that had called Anakin Skywalker the Chosen One, the one who would bring balance to the Force, was fulfilled, not in the way the Jedi had imagined it, not in the triumphant defense of the Order against the Sith, but in a throne room with his son dying on the floor and his master laughing, in a moment of choice that cost everything and saved everything simultaneously. This is what Order 66 could not destroy. It destroyed the institution. It destroyed the tradition, or nearly. It scattered the masters and killed the Padawans and turned the temple into an imperial headquarters, and made the words Jedi Knight into a whisper, and then a rumour, and then a legend that people told children about without quite believing. It did all of this with the thoroughness of a 1,000-year plan, executed by a genius of patient evil. But it could not destroy the Force. The Force moves through all living things, as it has always moved, as it moved through the frightened boy on Tatooine, and the old man in the Junlan wastes, and the princess on Alderaan who was carrying in her political ambitions and her fierce love for her adopted world the exact qualities she had inherited from the mother who died before she could know her. The Force is not an institution. It is not a doctrine. It cannot be executed. It finds the people it needs, in the moments it needs them, and it offers them what it offers, not certainty, not safety, not the knowledge of outcome, just the current. The living current beneath still water, the invitation to enter it. Luke entered it. Rey would enter it, generations later. The story continues because the Force continues, and the Force continues because it is not a thing that lives in buildings or doctrines, or the accumulated records of masters now dead. It lives in the willingness of a single person to open themselves to something larger than their own certainty, to act in accordance with what the living world requires, rather than what the fear of loss demands. Let your breath be very slow now. The story has come to its ending for tonight, and the ending is not resolution but continuation. The Force moving in its own time, larger than the Empire that tried to cut it off, larger than the darkness that tried to define it, larger than the fear that was used to turn the galaxy's greatest instrument against itself. You have held the whole arc tonight. The boy on Naboo, the patience of 1,000 years, the manufactured crisis and the engineered war, the dreams aimed at a wound, the single night, the survivors, the 20 years of darkness, the sun in the desert, the moment of choice in the throne room. Let it all settle now. Let it become the deep background hum of a story that is not over, that the Force is still writing in its own language, in its own time, in the lives of everyone willing to listen to what the living world has to say. The night is still. The breath is slow. The room is dark and safe and full of the particular comfort of a place that has held you through the longest hours and will still be holding you when the morning comes. The children were the answer that Sidious had not calculated. He had calculated for power, had understood that the most powerful Force users in the galaxy needed to be neutralized or co-opted, and had done both. He had calculated for institutions, had destroyed the Temple, scattered the Order, eliminated the transmission mechanisms by which the tradition renewed itself. He had calculated for the survivors, had sent the Inquisitors, had maintained Vader as the hunter, had kept the pressure consistent enough that hiding was a full-time occupation rather than a temporary posture. What he had not calculated for was time itself, the patience of the Force. The fact that the children he had allowed to live, allowed because they were infants and he was concerned with the present rather than the future, would grow into the future he had failed to account for. The binary sunset that Luke watched from the moisture farm on Tatooine is one of the most recognized images in the story, and it carries in its simplicity everything the story is most essentially about. A young man looking at a horizon he cannot cross yet, the longing in his body visible in the way he holds himself, arms slightly out, face tilted toward the fading light. He wants something. He does not know exactly what he wants, but the wanting is real and large and insistent, and the Force is in it, and the horizon is both the limit of his current life and the direction of what comes next. He is his father's son in this, in the capacity for longing, in the refusal to accept the boundaries of the available. But he is also different, shaped by a childhood of ordinary love rather than slavery, by an uncle who tried his best even when his best was constraining, by a desert that taught patience rather than urgency. The rebellion that grew from Bail Organa's initial conversations was not a Jedi project. It was a political project that Jedi happened to support because the political project was the same as the Jedi project. The restoration of a galaxy in which the Force could move freely, in which the Sith's dark architecture could not permanently define what was possible. The rebellion's members were mostly not Force-sensitive. They were just people who had decided that the Empire's version of the Order was not worth the price it charged, who had looked at the thunderous applause in the Senate chamber and decided that what was applauded there should be opposed here, by whatever means were available, for as long as that opposition was possible. The Force works through the available. This is perhaps the deepest lesson that Order 66's aftermath contains. It works through the 14-year-old who ran when he was told to run, and lived to become the teacher someone else needed. It works through the princess who carries her biological father's gifts without knowing they are his, and her adopted father's politics with the full knowledge that they are dangerous. It works through the old man in the desert who stopped being a Jedi in any institutional sense and became something that the institution had never quite managed to produce. A person who had loved and lost and failed and been broken and continued anyway, who had found in the continuing the specific wisdom that only continuing produces. Order 66 was the Empire's greatest triumph and its most consequential error. It destroyed the Jedi Order. It was not able to destroy the Force. And the Force, patient beyond any human understanding of patience, working in its own time through the available instruments, had already placed the necessary pieces on the board before the Emperor finished celebrating his victory. That is the shape of it. The darkness was thorough and real and lasted a long time. The light was small and hidden and took 20 years to find its footing, and then a boy on a desert world looked at the horizon, and the Force moved, and the story moved with it. Sleep now. The Force is with you. It has always been with you, and it will be with you when you wake. If you found your way here from somewhere in the world tonight, leave a comment when you wake. I always want to know where the story found you, and if there is a corner of the galaxy you would like to explore next, let me know. The archive is deep, the night is long, and there is always more to tell. End of script. Total, 22,025 words, 10 segments, Sleepy Maester, Sleep Story, Factonium, Facts Unlocked.